Let me start with something I know many women won't say out loud. Have you ever noticed how confusing it feels when a man doesn't pursue you, but also doesn't disappear completely? That strange emotional pause. That quiet wondering you don't fully admit to yourself. As both a clinical psychologist and a woman, I can tell you this with certainty. When pursuit doesn't happen, it doesn't feel neutral inside the female mind. It feels unfinished. And unfinished experiences stay with us far longer than clear endings. In my consultation room, women rarely say, "He didn't pursue me, so I moved on." What they actually say is, "I don't understand why this affected me so much." And that sentence matters, because it tells me the nervous system was expecting something that never arrived. Here's what most people don't realize. Female attraction is deeply tied to anticipation, not fantasy, and anticipation. The brain begins to predict emotional movement, interest, effort, consistency. When those signals don't appear, the brain doesn't switch off. It starts searching for meaning. Neurologically, this happens because the emotional brain doesn't like ambiguity. The amygdala registers uncertainty as a low-grade threat, not danger, but instability. And when emotional stability feels uncertain, the mind turns inward, not outward. This is the moment many women quietly start questioning themselves. Did I misread it? Was I too open? Did I expect too much? These thoughts don't come from insecurity. They come from a brain trying to reconcile mismatch. Your emotional system felt a signal. Your reality didn't confirm it. So your mind tries to close the gap. This is something no one warns women about. When a man doesn't pursue, the first emotional response is rarely anger or detachment. It's self-evaluation. And self-evaluation can slowly erode emotional safety if it happens repeatedly. As a woman, I understand how subtle this phase is. On the outside, you look fine, calm, rational. But internally, your nervous system is slightly activated. You replay moments, tone, timing, eye contact, not because you're attached, but because your brain hates unanswered questions. And here's an uncomfortable truth we don't talk about enough. When pursuit is absent, the female psyche doesn't assume lack of interest right away. It assumes missing information. And the brain will keep searching for that information until it either finds clarity or protects itself by pulling back. This isn't about chasing. It's about emotional coherence. And when coherence is missing, the mind fills the silence on its own. Let me tell you something I hear very often, and it's usually said quietly. I don't even know why I'm still thinking about it. No anger, no attachment claims, just confusion. As a woman and a clinician, I recognize this phase immediately. This is not longing. This is the mind stuck in an unresolved emotional loop. And unresolved loops are psychologically draining. When a man doesn't pursue, the female brain doesn't label it as rejection right away. Instead, it enters a monitoring state. I see this constantly in my practice. Women describe it as casually checking, not obsessing, looking for signs, not chasing. And that distinction matters. Because this isn't about desperation. It's about the brain needing confirmation. From a neuroscience perspective, this happens because dopamine was activated but never completed its cycle. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical people think it is. It's the anticipation chemical. When anticipation is interrupted, the brain doesn't stop, it waits. And waiting keeps emotional energy invested longer than intended. This is where many women feel frustrated with themselves. Why does this bother me? I don't even like him that much. And I often tell them, it's not about him. It's about the interruption. The nervous system prepared for movement that never came. That preparation doesn't disappear. just because you tell yourself to be logical. This is also where self-talk quietly shifts. At first, the mind looks inward. Did I misjudge? Later, it looks outward. Maybe he's emotionally unavailable. These thoughts aren't conclusions. They're stabilizers. The psyche is trying to reduce uncertainty without fully confronting disappointment. This is something no one prepares women for. Emotional ambiguity is far more taxing than rejection. Rejection hurts, but it ends the loop. Silence keeps it open. And open loops consume attention, energy, and emotional clarity. Over time, if pursuit still doesn't happen, something protective begins. The body gets tired before the heart does. The nervous system starts pulling energy back, not as punishment, but as preservation. She may seem calmer, less engaged, less curious, but internally, she's regulating. As a woman, I understand how subtle this shift feels. You don't announce it. You don't even fully notice it at first. You just stop leaning forward emotionally. You respond a little slower. You invest a little less. Not out of pride, out of self-respect that your body learned before your mind did. And here's the quiet truth. When a woman stops asking why, it's not indifference yet. It's preparation for emotional closure. And once the nervous system prepares to close a door, reopening it requires more than interest. It requires safety. There's a moment I recognize instantly, even before a woman explains it. Her voice steadies, her expression softens, and she says, "I think I just lost interest." But as a clinician and as a woman, I know that's not the full story. What's actually happening here is not loss of interest. It's emotional recalibration. When a man doesn't pursue for long enough, the female brain doesn't abruptly detach. It slowly reorganizes attachment. This is a quiet neurological shift, and it happens beneath awareness. Dopamine levels reduce, oxytocin never fully anchors, and without reinforcement, the emotional system chooses stability over desire. In my consultations, women often describe this phase with surprising calm. "He's a good person, I just don't feel pulled anymore." That word, pulled, is important. Attraction isn't logic. It's momentum. And momentum requires feedback. When effort doesn't meet interest, the nervous system stops investing forward energy. This is also where something deeply important happens. Self-respect steps into the foreground. A woman may still feel curiosity, but now it has to pass through her values. Thoughts like, "If he wanted to, he would," are not bitterness. They are boundaries forming. The prefrontal cortex begins to protect the emotional system from repeating an unreciprocated pattern. This is something no one really talks about. When a woman disengages internally, she doesn't argue or demand clarity. She doesn't create drama. She simply stops offering emotional access. And by the time this shows on the outside, the decision has already been rehearsed privately. There's also a quiet grief here. Not the grief of losing someone, but the grief of losing a possibility. The mind mourns what could have existed if effort had met interest. This mourning doesn't come with tears. It shows up in stillness. In acceptance. In the soft closing of emotional expectation. As a woman, I understand how this stage feels. You don't feel angry. You don't feel rejected. You feel resolved. And resolution is often mistaken for indifference by the other person. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Once the female psyche processes a connection as incomplete and emotionally costly, it rarely reopens it. Not because of ego, but because the nervous system remembers how much energy uncertainty required. So when someone later says, "She changed," what they're really seeing is adaptation. The attraction didn't disappear overnight. It was slowly outgrown. And once that internal shift completes, words alone can't reverse it. Because the decision wasn't made in the mind. It was made in the body. There's something I want to say gently, because it's often misunderstood. When a woman looks calm after not being pursued, that calm is not emptiness, it's recovery. And recovery can look deceptively quiet. As a woman and a clinician, I see this stage clearly. It's the moment when the nervous system finally stops bracing. That low-level tension, the waiting, the wondering, the emotional readiness, it releases. And when it releases, what follows isn't excitement or sadness. It's relief. In my consultations, women describe this phase in almost the same words. I just feel lighter. I don't feel on edge anymore. That's not indifference. That's the parasympathetic nervous system taking over after prolonged uncertainty. The body realizes it no longer needs to stay alert for emotional signals that never arrived. And when the body relaxes, attachment loosens. This is something no one warns women about. Emotional exhaustion can masquerade as emotional clarity. After carrying unanswered questions for too long, the psyche decides it's safer to let go than to keep hoping. Not because hope is weak, but because hope without reciprocity is draining. At this stage, memory also changes. The brain doesn't erase the person, it rewrites the emotional tone attached to them. Moments that once felt warm now feel distant. Not painful, distant. This is the mind protecting itself from reopening an experience that lacked consistency. As a woman, I recognize this internal shift deeply. You stop romanticizing, you start observing. Flaws you once softened now register clearly. Not harshly, honestly. The emotional filter that once highlighted potential has switched off, and without that filter, attraction often cannot survive. Here's where many people get confused. If interest suddenly appears now, it rarely lands the way it once would have. Instead of excitement, it creates dissonance. Instead of relief, caution. Because the nervous system has already adapted to absence. It doesn't want to relearn uncertainty. This is a firm truth. Late pursuit doesn't feel flattering to a regulated nervous system. It feels destabilizing. The body asks, why now? And when the answer isn't clear, the system protects its calm. So if you're wondering why a woman seems emotionally unreachable after a period of non-pursuit, understand this. You're meeting her after she's already healed. Not from you, but from the waiting. She didn't become distant overnight. She didn't shut down out of pride. She simply finished a psychological process that required rest at the end. And once a woman associates emotional peace with letting go, it becomes very difficult to convince her to trade that peace for uncertainty again. There's a question women rarely ask out loud, but I hear it often between the lines. Why do I understand it so clearly now, when it's already over? That clarity can feel almost unsettling. As a clinician and as a woman, I want you to know this. Clarity often arrives after emotional detachment, not before it. When the emotional charge settles, the thinking brain finally has space to work. And what emerges isn't longing, it's meaning. At this stage, when a woman thinks about a man who didn't pursue her, the thought doesn't come with a pull in the chest anymore. It comes with perspective. The brain has reclassified the experience. Neuroscience shows us that memory is not stored as events, but as emotional summaries. And once the emotional intensity fades, the summary changes. In my consultations, women often say things like, I see it differently now, or I understand what that situation was teaching me. That sentence tells me everything. The connection has moved from the emotional brain to the reflective mind. And once that shift happens, attachment rarely survives. This is where an internal narrative forms, quietly, without drama. She starts understanding patterns, availability, effort, consistency. And here's the part many people don't realize. This understanding doesn't come with resentment. It comes with adjustment. Her standards subtly change. This is something no one warns women about. When a man doesn't pursue, he doesn't just exit the picture. He often becomes a reference point, not a desire, a lesson, a moment that helped define what no longer feels acceptable. At this stage, even if he crosses her mind, it's usually in neutral moments. A familiar place, a passing memory. The thought appears, then dissolves. There's no emotional spike. No urge to reach out. That's how we know the attachment has truly completed its cycle. As a woman, I recognize how grounding this phase feels. You don't feel triumphant. You don't feel hurt. You feel aligned. The nervous system prefers coherence, and now things finally make sense. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Once a woman processes a connection cognitively rather than emotionally, reopening it feels unnatural. Not because she's closed off, but because her system already categorized the experience as complete. And the brain resists reopening chapters it has already learned from. So yes, she may think of him again. But not with hope. Not with regret. With understanding. And understanding has a way of closing doors very gently and very permanently. There's a point in this process that almost no one talks about because it isn't emotional in the way people expect. No heartbreak, no anger, just a quiet internal decision that sounds like this. I won't open myself like that again unless it's clear. As a woman and as a clinician, I see this shift very clearly. This is not emotional shutdown. It's emotional efficiency. After experiencing non-pursuit, the psyche doesn't become colder. It becomes more selective. The nervous system learns where energy was lost and quietly adjusts to prevent that loss from happening again. In my consultations, women at this stage speak differently. Earlier, there was confusion. Then there was reflection. Now, there's discernment. She doesn't analyze mixed signals anymore. She doesn't romanticize uncertainty. Her body has learned that ambiguity feels unsafe, even if the mind tries to justify it. From a neurological perspective, this makes sense. The brain uses past emotional experiences to predict future outcomes. When inconsistency is registered repeatedly, the prefrontal cortex steps in earlier and says, "We don't need to go there." Attraction doesn't even fully activate. Not because desire is gone, but because the system recognizes the pattern before attachment forms. This is something no one warns women about. After non-pursuit, chemistry alone stops being convincing. Intensity without reliability no longer feels exciting. It feels familiar. And familiarity without safety doesn't read as love to a regulated nervous system. At this stage, women often appear more independent, more grounded, sometimes even harder to impress. But this isn't ego. It's calibration. She has learned that mutual effort is not a bonus, it's a requirement. And her body now filters out situations where that requirement isn't met. As a woman, I want to say this clearly. There is also a quiet grief here, not for the man, but for the version of herself that once waited, hoped, and stayed emotionally open without clarity. That version isn't gone, but she's protected now. So when a woman doesn't respond the way she once did, it's not because she stopped caring. It's because she learned how much caring costs when it isn't reciprocated. And once that lesson is integrated into the nervous system, it doesn't disappear for the next person. It becomes part of how she loves, how she chooses, and how she protects her peace. There's a realization that arrives much later than people expect. Not during the silence, not during the confusion, but long after the emotional system has settled. It comes quietly, often in an ordinary moment. I didn't lose him, she realizes. I outgrew the version of myself that would have waited. As a woman and as a clinician, I can tell you this is the final psychological shift. By this stage, the experience is no longer about the man at all. It's about identity. About how she now understands herself in relationships, and what she is no longer willing to normalize. In my consultations, women at this point speak with a grounded certainty. They don't ask what went wrong. They ask what felt off. That difference matters. It shows the brain has stopped personalizing the absence of pursuit and has started interpreting it as information. Neuroscience supports this. The brain is constantly updating its internal models. Once enough evidence accumulates, the model changes permanently. Attraction without action stops registering as romantic. It registers as misalignment. And once something is categorized as misalignment, the nervous system doesn't argue with it anymore. This is something no one warns women about. When this realization integrates, self-blame dissolves. She no longer wonders if she asked for too much or expected too soon. She understands that emotional presence is not something to negotiate for. It's either there or it isn't. At this stage, emotional boundaries feel natural, not forced. She doesn't chase clarity. She doesn't wait for potential to become real. She trusts patterns over promises. And this trust isn't cynical, it's calm. Her body feels safer now because it no longer invests without reciprocity. So if you ever wonder why a woman didn't come back when interest finally appeared, this is often why. Not because she didn't care, but because caring without consistency no longer fits who she has become. The final truth is this. When a man doesn't pursue a woman, he may assume nothing happened. But internally, something completed, a cycle closed. A threshold was crossed. And the woman who emerges on the other side is not waiting anymore. Not for messages that arrive late. Not for effort that feels uncertain. Not for connection that requires self-doubt. She's simply unavailable to ambiguity now. And psychologically speaking, that kind of clarity is not something she gives up easily.